The timeline, lore, and universe of Mad Max is storied, confusing, and also very interesting. I'll break down everything you need to know in today's video. Mad Max, one of the best received franchises in the science fiction genre, and an interesting, confusing, and insane look at a post-apocalyptic dystopian future Earth unlike any other. The series was created by doctor-turned-filmmaker George Miller, who has written and directed all 5 entries in the film series. Mad Max, unlike many other sci-fi of the 70s and 80s, actually doesn't have a ton of supplemental material. Aside from the 5 films, the only real media expanding the world of Mad Max is a 2015 video game, which isn't seen as fully canon, although Miller consulted on it, as well as some adaptations of the movies themselves in novel and comic form. So, in today's video, we are going to look at the lore and world building of the Mad Max series, exploring the timeline of the eventual decline of civilization. Our journey starts with the first film in the series, simply titled Mad Max. This was an extremely low-budget Australian independent movie released in 1979. We're not going to be tackling the behind-the-scenes of the movie too much, but it's important to acknowledge that the low-budget production of the film does give it a visual distinction compared with the twisted hellscape we see in future films. In the original Mad Max, we don't really have the iconic desert wasteland or armies of freaks building structures out of the remnants of the old world. Society is still functioning here, although it's teetering on the edge. However, we are of course introduced to the title character. Max Rokitansky is an elite member of the dwindling law enforcement agency, the Main Force Patrol, or the MFP, leather jacket-clad protectors of Australia. When we first meet Max, he is driving a 1974 Ford Falcon, a former Victorian police car, which served as the basis for the stock MFP vehicles in the film. Here, Max is a family man with a wife and son, and is looking to retire from the MFP as the community is being relentlessly terrorized by a group of criminals known as the Zed Runners, or Acolytes. They're essentially a group of violent criminals led by the main antagonist of the film, Toe Cutter. What exactly has caused civilization to decline is not really elaborated on. Although we know there's an oil crisis, and later material explains that this has to do with the Persian Gulf War. One really common point of confusion for people is whether there was a nuclear war. And yes, but that comes later. What we see in Mad Max 1 and 2 is really just society falling apart as the economy completely collapses. In that way, the differences in budget and filming is actually kind of a benefit because you're seeing the apocalypse as it happens. Anyway, with the Acolytes consistently at odds with the MFP, Toe Cutter puts a hit out on Max's colleague Goose, who does die, pushing Max even further away from the MFP. This is probably the perfect time to draw attention to the fact that Max doesn't even seem entirely mad yet. He's just a typical family man trying to support his wife and son, but I suppose mild-mannered Max isn't quite as catchy a title. In Mad Max 1 and pretty much every Mad Max movie, Max is traditionally not the center of attention. Most of the running time of the movie focuses primarily on Goose and Toe Cutter. We see Max and learn about him as a character, but it isn't until the last half hour that it becomes his movie and we see the beginnings of the character which has become so iconic. And this is where the birth of Mad Max exists. The world itself is a reflection of the character. Much like the state of the world, Max is just barely latching on to innocence and normalcy with his family. The death of Goose is the inciting incident telling him he needs to keep what matters to him. Unfortunately, his family is murdered at the hands of Toe Cutter and his gang, and in a sense, the death of Max, as we know it, follows. His life is no longer about maintaining justice, it's now fully centered on vengeance. Max dons his iconic leather jacket and gets behind the wheel of an all-black V8 Interceptor known as the Pursuit Special in order to hunt down those responsible for the deaths of Goose and his family. The film ends with Max achieving his mission, but driving off into an uncertain future, a future which was uncertain not just for the character in the film, but also the filmmaker, because as we established, the film is extremely different from everything that follows, with the reason being that Mad Max wasn't actually supposed to be set in the near future. It was meant to be a modern-day crime action film, but the production just didn't have the budget for additional extras and locations. resulting in the opening title and the backstory of the government's collapse being established at the last minute. The film, especially given its low budget, was a big financial success, leading to George Miller wanting to expand upon the world of the film in a sequel. However, the problem is that Mad Max was recognized in Australia where it was made and widely released, and its sequel was now going to be a massive Hollywood-produced film that needed to grab a new American audience. This resulted in Mad Max 2 being retitled The Road Warrior in the US, and for a large audience, this was the introduction to the character of Max. Since the conclusion of the first movie, the world has fallen further into disarray. The beginning of the second movie also provides some more context for what happened. It explains that basically a massive world war was started by two factions, which again led to the collapse of civilization, not just in Australia, but across the globe, as economies ground to a halt. Whether there was nuclear war at this point isn't crystal clear. To me, based on Thunderdome, I read the war is happening sometime between Mad Max 2 and Mad Max 3, though of course there could have been strikes across the globe, perhaps Australia just wasn't involved. It's really the third movie where the existence of nuclear war in some form is made clear. When meeting with the Lost Tribe, we learn of the Poxeclipse, obviously Apocalypse, with Australia at least being hit by one bomb as evidenced by the mushroom cloud. Before Fury Road, the timeline of the three movies was Mad Max 1 took place in 1984, Mad Max 2 took place 3 years after, then Mad Max 3, the significant time jump 15 years afterwards. Post Fury Road, some of this has been recontextualized with comics. Whether those are fully canon or not, I kind of doubt it. It honestly doesn't really matter, especially for a franchise like Mad Max, where the stories are really meant to be enjoyed without a greater context to the universe. Watching Fury Road, it's not immediately clear when this takes place, whether it is meant to be the same Mad Max or a reimagining of the character, whether the timeline has been fully reset and this is a new story, and it doesn't really matter. Mad Max, even in the films, especially the intro to Mad Max 2, is portrayed more than anything else like a legend of the wasteland. He's a Clint Eastwood, man with no name type of character. Still, if you do care about continuity, Fury Road takes place after Mad Max 3, and it's been decades since the fall of society. In this new world, Max is no longer an average peacekeeper, but instead a stoic scavenger trying to survive in an insane wasteland which has just continued to deteriorate. Furiosa is going to be our first time seeing an earlier point in the Mad Max timeline from a new perspective, but will the movie add to the lore of the franchise or create more inconsistencies? For me personally, I don't care as long as the movie's good, and either way, we've got a ton more coverage planned, so check back for our look here at Furiosa when the film officially releases. But let me know down in the comments, how do you prefer to enjoy franchises like Mad Max? Do you want to get fully into the lore, or are you more into the artistry of each individual film? I think most of you know that. I do like to know the backstory, but for me, let's see how each film stands on its own. That's all I've got though. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Subscribe if you enjoyed. Bye-bye.